The year was 1961, the height of the Cold War. In the corridors of the Kremlin and the halls of the Pentagon, a silent, terrifying game of chess was being played. But the board wasn't made of wood, it was made of the vast, unforgiving depths of the Atlantic Ocean. For years, the United States held the upper hand with its Polaris missile program. These American submarines were silent, lethal, and capable of striking Moscow from thousands of miles away without warning. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was obsessed with parity. He demanded a counterweapon that would restore the balance of terror. He didn't want a defensive tool. He wanted a hammer that could shatter the American dream from the deep. This was the birth of Project 658, known to the West as the Hotel-class submarine. Its flagship was the K-19. But in the rush to beat the Americans, the Soviet Union was about to build a vessel that was more dangerous to its own crew than to its enemies. In the frozen northern shipyard of Severodvinsk, the air was thick with the smell of welding ozone and the crushing weight of impossible deadlines. The K-19 was a technological leap forward, powered by twin Vienna pressurized water reactors. But to achieve the speed and depth Khrushchev demanded, Soviet engineers had to make compromises that would haunt the ship forever. The reactors were packed so tightly into the hull that there was virtually no room for maintenance, let alone backup safety systems. The cooling pipes, the literal veins of the nuclear hardware, welded by workers who were exhausted, underfed, and terrified of failing the party. To speed up production, the engineers decided to omit a secondary cooling system. It was a gamble of catastrophic proportions. They assumed that if the primary system failed, the submarine would simply surface. They never accounted for a catastrophic leak in the high-pressure circuit while submerged in enemy territory. As the hull took shape, the K-19 began to earn a dark reputation among the shipyard workers. It wasn't just difficult build. It seemed to actively hunger for life. In 1959, while the interior was being fitted, a fire broke out in the sixth compartment. 3 workers were trapped behind a steel bulkhead and burned to death. Just months later, a young engineer was crushed by a falling 1-ton Missilia T. Then, a freak accident involving the hull-less rubber coating led to a massive fire that nearly destroyed the ship before it ever touched the water. Even the medical officer assigned to the crew was killed in a bizarre accident involving a bus just days before the first sea trials. By the time the crew of 139 men stepped onto the deck, they weren't looking at a technological marvel. They were looking at a Widowmaker, a ship built on a foundation of accidents and bad omens. The climax of this cursed beginning occurred during the official launch ceremony. In naval tradition, the christening of a ship is a sacred moment. A bottle of champagne must shatter against the bow to invite the protection of the sea. As the Soviet High Command and the families of the sailors watched, a captain stepped forward. He swung the bottle with all his might, but instead of the satisfying crash of glass, there was a dull, rubbery thud. The bottle bounced off the hull, unbroken. The crowd gasped. The sailors looked at each other in horror. In the superstitious world of the deep, an unbroken bottle is a death sentence. The K-19 had been rejected by the ocean before its mission even began. As she slipped into the dark waters of the Arctic, the Hiroshima of the deep was ready to meet its destiny. The fuse was lit, and the world was about to discover what happens when national pride outweighs human life. By July 1961, the K-19 was no longer a shipyard project. It was a ghost haunting the depths of the Norwegian Sea. Submerged hundreds of feet below the surface, the crew lived in a world of recycled air and artificial light. Their mission was high stakes: shadow a NATO naval exercise and demonstrate the terrifying reach of Soviet nuclear power. Captain Nikolai Zateyev, a veteran of the submarine fleet, knew his ship was experimental, but he trusted the steel around him. What he didn't know was that the Widowmaker was already preparing its first strike, deep within the reactor compartment. The immense pressure of the ocean was searching for a weakness. It found it in a single, brittle weld on a cooling pipe. At 4:15 a.m., while most of the crew slept in their narrow bunks, that weld finally gave way. The primary cooling circuit, the lifeblood of the nuclear reactor, burst open. In an instant, the pressure dropped to zero, and the countdown to a global catastrophe began. To understand the terror of the next few minutes, one must understand the physics of a pressurized water reactor. A nuclear core is like a sun trapped in a box. It requires a constant, high-pressure flow of water to carry away the immense heat generated by uranium fuel. When the pipe snapped, that water vanished. Within seconds, the temperature of the fuel rods began to skyrocket. It wasn't just a fire, it was a thermal runaway. The temperature climbed past 500 degrees Celsius, then 700 degrees Celsius, heading toward the melting point of 1000 degrees Celsius. If the uranium melted, it would pool at the bottom of the reactor, creating a massive steam explosion. In the confined space of a submarine, this would be catastrophic, but the stakes were higher than the lives of the 139 men on board. The K-19 was positioned near a secret NATO base. If a nuclear-powered submarine exploded in these waters, the Americans would almost certainly interpret the blast as a preemptive nuclear strike. The world was standing on the edge of a total nuclear exchange, all because of a single broken pipe. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere shifted from routine to pure horror. As the engineering crew rushed to investigate the drop in pressure, they were met with a sight that defied logic. A faint, ghostly blue glow began to emanate from the reactor compartment. This was Cherenkov radiation, a phenomenon where particles travel faster than the speed of light through a medium. It was a beautiful, haunting light, but it was the signature of death. The air in the compartment began to smell of ozone, and the sailors reported a strange, metallic taste on their tongues. This was a sensation of ionizing radiation, literally stripping electrons from their DNA. The ship's Geiger counters were useless. The radiation levels were so high they simply maxed out, their needles pinned to the far right. The crew was now breathing air that was slowly killing them, and they had no way to stop the heat from rising. Every minute that passed brought the reactor core closer to a total meltdown. Captain Zateyev stood in the control room, surrounded by the frantic reports of his officers. He had two options, and both were death sentences. He could surface and broadcast a distress signal. If he did, the Americans would hear it. They would arrive, rescue the crew, and seize the K-19, the Soviet Union's most classified military secrets, and its nuclear warheads. He would be labeled a traitor, and his family would suffer the consequences. His other option was to stay submerged and attempt a repair that every engineer knew was impossible. It would require men to enter the Blue Room, the heart of the radiation zone, without any protective gear. They would have to weld a new pipe onto a white-hot reactor. Zateyev looked at his young engineers, some only 19 years old. He knew he was about to ask them to commit suicide to save the world. As the temperature hit the critical mark, the order was given. The suicide squad was formed. The order was given, but it wasn't a command. It was a death sentence. To stop the meltdown, a team of 8 volunteers was formed. These were young men engineers and mechanics who understood exactly what radiation does to human tissue. They had no lead-lined suits, no robotic arms, and no remote sensors. Their only equipment consisted of standard-issue chemical gas masks and thin plastic raincoats. The plan was as primitive as it was desperate. They had to enter the reactor compartment, where the air was thick with lethal isotopes, and weld a makeshift cooling line directly onto the primary circuit. As the heavy steel door creaked open, a blast of white-hot steam and invisible fire hit them. They weren't just stepping into a room. They were stepping into a microwave that would cook their internal organs from the inside out. They entered in pairs, knowing that every second spent in the blue room was cutting years off their lives. Inside the compartment, the sound of the welding torch was the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. The radiation levels were so astronomical that the men began to experience the effects of acute radiation syndrome within minutes. Their skin began to redden, as if they were standing under a desert sun. One by one, after their 10-minute shifts, the men emerged. The sights were horrific. Their faces were already starting to swell. Their eyes were turning blood red from bursting capillaries, and they began to vomit. Uncontrollably, a sign that their digestive tracts were already failing. Despite the unimaginable agony, they succeeded. They managed to weld the pipe and restart the flow of water. The core temperature began to drop. They had saved the K-19, and perhaps the world. But as they slumped against the bulkheads, they were already ghosts. Their DNA had been shattered beyond repair. They were literally falling apart at a molecular level. While the K-19 floated crippled on the surface, its crew dying and its deck contaminated, a shadow appeared on the horizon. It was the USS Gearing, an American destroyer. The U.S. Navy, sensing a nuclear disaster, approached and offered immediate medical aid and a tow to safety. This created a final, agonizing test for Captain Zatiev. He was a patriot, and he knew that accepting American help meant the K-19 nuclear secrets and its missile technology would fall into enemy hands. To the Soviet High Command, this was treason. Zatiev looked at his dying men, their skin turning purple, their bodies giving out, and he made a chilling choice. He refused the American help. He feared a mutiny from his own crew, but he feared the KGB even more. He ordered his men to wait in the radioactive air for days, till a Soviet rescue submarine finally arrived. It was a brutal display of Cold War pride over human life. When the K-19 finally returned to the motherland, there were no medals, no parades, and no headlines. The Soviet government, obsessed with maintaining the image of perfection, classified the entire incident. The 8 engineers who saved the ship were sent to a secret hospital in Moscow. They died in excruciating pain within 3 weeks. Because their bodies were so highly radioactive, they couldn't be buried in normal graves. They were placed in lead coffins, and the lids were welded shut to prevent the radiation from leaking into the soil. For 28 years, their families were forbidden from telling the truth. The K-19 itself was repaired and sent back to sea, where it continued to suffer fires and accidents, earning the permanent name, the Widowmaker. Today, the story of K-19 stands as a warning. It is a story of how the courage of a few young men prevented a nuclear war, and how the silence of a regime tried to erase their names from history. Their sacrifice remains a haunting echo from the deeper reminder that in the game of empires, it is always the soldiers who pay the price. Do you think the captain was right to refuse American help?